Welcome to the 27th video on ancient Greece and part 11 of the Peloponnesian War. Now, in the last video, we dealt with the implosion of the Athenian forces in Sicily. Now, there were a couple of questions that came in, and I'd like to answer those now before we move on. One of the questions involved the small fleet that the Spartans dispatched to Sicily. And did the Athenians have advanced intelligence about this fleet? And the answer to that is Nicias certainly knew about that fleet. And I think the Athenians could have dealt with that fleet pretty easily early on, but they chose not to, and that again was another big mistake the Athenians made in Sicily, because as we know now, Gylippus certainly turned the entire situation around in Sicily. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Now, as we know now, the entire Sicilian expedition was a complete and utter failure. And of course, Nicias and Demosthenes were both executed. Now, word of the disaster did not reach Athens until the fall of 413 BC. Initially, there was disbelief in Athens. But when the reality finally set in, there was some serious panic-mongering going on in Athens. The Athenians thought the Peloponnesians were going to sail right into Piraeus and capture both Piraeus and Athens. So there was the real possibility that the war could be over very quickly. Now, Thucydides will tell us that most of ancient Greece was elated over the disaster that had befallen Athens in Sicily. And you will remember that most of Greece was behind Sparta, because as I mentioned before in a previous video, most of the Greek cities thought the Athenians were starting an empire, similar to what the Persians had done. And so they were rooting for Sparta to win the Peloponnesian War. And now that Athens had suffered this total disaster in Sicily, most of the Greek cities wanted to launch an immediate assault on Athens, knowing that that would end the war outright. And so, as I said, there was a real possibility that the Peloponnesian War could come to a very quick and swift end. But that did not happen, and there were a couple of reasons for that I will talk about in this video. Now, the first reason was that the Athenians had a trick up their sleeve. They had kept 100 triremes and 1,000 talents in reserve, and this was done in case Athens suffered a total disaster, which of course happened in Sicily. And so the situation wasn't completely hopeless as it had first appeared. And so the Athenians would need to immediately deploy the 100 triremes they had in reserve and also start spending the 1,000 talents left in their treasury. And that meant rebuilding their battered fleet. Now, as a result of the Peloponnesian victory in Sicily, the Spartans now wanted to expand the war. And that was the very thing that Nicias had warned the Athenian assembly about if the Athenians suffered a setback in Sicily. And as I mentioned before, many city-states around Greece wanted to assault Athens. And Thucydides will tell us the reason for this was that many cities in Greece felt that if the Sicilian expedition had succeeded, they would have been next on the Athenian hit list. But the main problem facing Athens at this point was that several cities within the Athenian Empire were on the verge of revolting. Now, the main city that was on the verge of revolting was Chios. And you can see on the map here it's situated between Lesbos and Samos off the coast of modern-day Turkey. So it's one of those very important Ionian cities in the Athenian Empire. Now, Chios was one of the largest money makers for the Athenians, so it was very important that the Athenians suppress any revolt that might occur there. Now, Chios, in secret, sent envoys to Sparta, and they asked the Spartans for assistance if they started a rebellion against Athens. And the idea here was that this would start a broad Ionian revolt. And again, this was all done in secret. The Chians also promised Sparta a fleet of ships that could join the Peloponnesian navy. And that was very enticing to the Spartans because, of course, they desperately needed ships to finish off Athens. And the Chians were one of the few cities left in the Athenian Empire that actually had a fleet. Now, even more ominously, the Persians approached the Spartans, and that could spell a lot of trouble for Athens, because the last thing the Athenians needed was an alliance between Sparta and Persia. Now, the Spartans chose to help Chios because, as I said, Chios actually had a fleet that the Spartans could use. And of course, the Spartans hoped that a rebellion in Chios would lead to an overall Ionian rebellion against Athens, and just perhaps that would bring a quick end to the war, especially with Athens in a weakened state. Now, the Athenians soon discovered the plot in Chios and desired to stop the oligarchs in that city who were behind the plot. And so the Athenians demanded the Chians hand over 10 ships as a sign of fealty. Now, the Chians had no choice but to submit to the Athenians because the Peloponnesian fleet was still gathering in the Isthmus of Corinth, and also there were still ships in Sicily. And so, again, the Chians had to submit to Athens. And so the revolt had not started yet. Now, the Athenians desperately wanted to prevent the Peloponnesian navy from linking up with the Chians, and that in turn would prevent the start of a revolt. Now, eventually, the Peloponnesian navy set sail, but they were forced to retreat back to their harbor by 21 Athenian ships. Later, the Athenian navy attacked the Peloponnesian ships in the harbor and damaged several Peloponnesian vessels. So even in a weakened state, the Athenians were still formidable at sea. And the Spartans were still intimidated by the Athenian navy, and so they were reluctant to challenge the Athenian navy in the open sea. And so Chios was a little reluctant to start the revolt because the Spartans had not arrived on the island yet. And so the possibility of a revolt was halted dead in its tracks, at least for now. Now, back in Sparta, Alcibiades is acting more like a Spartan than an Athenian. And we've all heard of the term living a Spartan lifestyle. And so he eats and drinks like a Spartan. I wonder if he actually had that famous Spartan black soup. Well, who knows? But in any event, Alcibiades starts to cause problems in Sparta. And apparently he couldn't inhibit all of his passions. And he starts an affair with the king's wife. So that ought to reveal something about Alcibiades' character. He apparently had absolutely no limitations. And so Alcibiades now needs to get out of town quick as his enemies are starting to pile up in Sparta. Because the Spartans probably were not in the best of moods when they heard about Alcibiades' affair with the king's wife. And so he quickly seeks out one of the Spartan ephors, who was one of his last allies in Sparta. And he convinces him to allow him to travel to Chios. And Alcibiades promises that once he's in Chios, he will convince the Chians that the Spartan fleet really is coming. Now, amazingly, Alcibiades actually pulls this off. He not only convinces the Spartans to let him travel to Chios, but once he arrives at the island, he actually succeeds in convincing the Chians to start a rebellion. And as the Athenians feared, this started a rebellion in several other Ionian cities. Now, around this time, the Athenians had some more success at sea against the Peloponnesian fleet. The Athenian fleet intercepted around 16 ships returning from Sicily, and they were able to wipe out that fleet just outside the Corinthian Gulf. But the rebellions in the Athenian Empire became a big problem. And it got even worse when Sparta and Persia in 412 BC signed a treaty. And again, that was the last thing the Athenians needed, because the Persians had pretty much stayed out of Greek affairs for decades. Now, this treaty, though, initially would be problematic for Sparta, as the Persians proved to be quite unreliable in terms of the promises they made to the Peloponnesian League. Mainly that involved providing forces and payment to the Peloponnesians. But we'll get to that in a few slides. Now, Athens didn't wait around for this rebellion to spread, and so they redirected the remnants of their navy to set up a blockade at Chios. And as I said, Chios was one of the greatest cities in the Athenian Empire, and so Athens could not allow this revolt to continue. The Athenians put together every available ship they had, and even confiscated the ships that the Chians had handed over earlier, and then set sail for Chios. Now, a small contingent of Athenian ships arrived at Chios, but were too weak to set up an initial blockade. Meanwhile, Alcibiades pushed down to Miletus, where he started a rebellion there. So as you can see, Alcibiades is a constant problem for the Athenians in exile. Now, Miletus also signed a treaty with Persia, and so now Miletus had the mighty Persian Empire to back them up. Now, the Athenians sent the bulk of their fleet to Samos, and they established that as their main base, because Samos was still firmly in the hands of the Athenians. But the Peloponnesians won a small victory in the Saronic Gulf when they defeated the Athenian ships that were blockading them, and they even succeeded in capturing 4 Athenian ships. Now, the man in charge of the Peloponnesian fleet was Astyochus, and we'll talk more about him in a little bit. Now, as a result of this victory, Astyochus was able to set sail towards Chios. Now, in normal times, the Peloponnesian fleet wouldn't have dared to sail around the North Aegean, but numbers now were on their side as a result of the Athenian disaster in Sicily. Now, once again, the Athenians were setting up shop at Samos, and were gathering all of their forces on that island. Now, before the Athenians could arrive at Chios, Astyochus set sail for Lesbos to encourage a revolt there. And so this was becoming a very, very tense situation for the Athenian Empire. With sufficient ships at hand, the Athenians finally decided to launch an attack against Chios, and the Athenian navy smashed right into the Chian harbor and destroyed several of the Chian ships. And with that victory, they were able to lay siege to Chios itself. The Athenians also set sail for Lesbos and were able to lay siege to that city as well, and eventually they were able to bring back Lesbos into the Athenian Empire. Chios, however, against all odds, held out against the Athenian siege. Now, with Chios under siege and basically taken out of the picture, the Athenians launched an attack against Miletus, the third major city that had rebelled against the Athenians. And just as the Athenians were about to take the city, the Spartans appeared on the scene and the Athenians retreated back to Samos. Now, if the Athenians had taken Miletus, they may have crushed the rebellion altogether, but that was a key setback for the Athenians, because Miletus would become the main headquarters for the Spartans. And so there was a little bit of a standstill for a while. The Spartans tried to assemble a fleet at Miletus, while the Athenians continued to hang out at Samos. And of course, the Athenians also had Chios under siege. Now, the Athenian armed forces at Samos began to receive more reinforcements and ships. And with Chios under siege, the main task of the Athenians at Samos was to keep an eye on Miletus, which was the last major city under revolt. So basically, the Athenian commanders at Samos decided to keep one force at Chios, and the other force was to keep a watchful eye, as I said, on any naval movements around Miletus. Now, Thucydides states that there were 74 ships at Samos, not including the ships that were blockading Chios. Now, one interesting point to make here was that the Spartans were still leery about taking on the Athenians at sea, even though both navies were about the same size. But it also is clearly evident that Athens no longer had complete control of the Aegean after the disastrous Sicilian Expedition, because there would have been no way that the Spartans would have sent any ships to Miletus before the Sicilian campaign. Now, the Athenians constantly harassed the Spartan fleet at Miletus, but still the Spartans continued to do nothing. Now, the Chians were desperate and asked the Spartans to relieve the siege of their city, but still the Spartan navy refused to move, even though, as I mentioned, they had sufficient numbers to try and launch an attack against the Athenian navy. Now, the Athenians decided to construct a fort on land at Delphinium, which was very close to Chios. So this added pressure not only by sea, but also by land. And so now the Chians were under siege from both sea and land. And again, they asked the Spartans for help. And again, the Spartan naval commander, Astyochus, refused to move. But a little while later, Astyochus received some important news. The Spartans had sent 27 ships to reinforce the Peloponnesian navy at Miletus. And so Astyochus set sail to link up with that fleet. And after some brief engagements with the Athenian navy, all of the Peloponnesian ships linked up at a place called Cnidus. And so that was a small victory for the Peloponnesian fleet. Now, in early 411 BC, a big problem occurred for Athens. Rhodes revolted, and then there was disturbing news that Euboea might even revolt. Now, Rhodes had been encouraged by the Spartans to start a rebellion, and the Athenians sent some forces from Samos to lay siege to Rhodes. And Rhodes asked Sparta for help to relieve the siege, and once again Sparta did nothing. And so the Spartans were not really sending a good message to some of their new allies. Now, meanwhile, Astyochus, the Spartan commander in charge of the Peloponnesian fleet, received orders from Sparta to execute Alcibiades. And so now Alcibiades had a death sentence from not only Athens, but also Sparta. And so where could Alcibiades go? Well, he only had one option now, and that was Persia. And so he presented himself to the Persian satrap, Tisipherne. And unbelievably, he turned against Sparta completely. He convinced the Persians to cut off the supplies to the Peloponnesians at Miletus. And he even convinced the Persians to cut off supplies to Chios and some of the other cities that he had prodded to revolt against the Athenians. And so Alcibiades is doing a complete 180 here. And so I think the main point to take away from all of this is that Alcibiades was basically only interested in Alcibiades. Now, he also seemed to be trying to set up a return to Athens, and he convinced the Persians that Athens would make a better ally than Sparta. And basically, he told the Persians that the Athenians were really not a threat by land, but Sparta was a major threat if they were allowed to set up a base at Miletus, because that, of course, was in modern-day Turkey. Now, keep in mind, the Persians had control of all of the land in modern-day Turkey, inland. The Athenians controlled some of the coastal cities, except, of course, the ones that were in revolt. And so, as I said, Alcibiades is playing yet another hand in this dangerous game of his, and he is eventually working his way back to Athens, and we will get to that in the next video.